I feel we're going out on a bang actually, because we've got someone here tonight, a good friend of mine, who actually understands the radio spectrum, and she's going to talk to us about the radio spectrum and, what is it, analogue to digital? And stuff?
Yes,
and stuff. So
it's the stuff that gets you.
I'm sure we're in for a treat. So I'll leave you with James' careful hands, and I'm sure you will enjoy this talk, and hopefully you will want to write stunning messages in our visitors book, because we are building a body of evidence to wow the Heritage Lottery Fund to give us some mega bucks to buy this place. So if you want us to stay, we need mega testimonials in our visitors book and on Facebook and anywhere else that you can think of putting mega messages. So with that, I'll leave you with James.
To come here on the closing session of this particular event that you've been able to have for 3 months here on Hall Street. 16 years ago, I had the privilege of speaking to a bunch of Italian radio engineers about 3G mobile phones out at the Villa Grifoni, where, as you all know, Marconi did his first early work. And I thought that was magic, to be able to go back to where Marconi started his work. It never entered my head that I would then have the opportunity to stand and address a group of eminent British radio engineers and their friends and families at the Hall Street Works. I mean, that, for a girl who was born half a mile up the road, that is just quite exceptional. It really is. And so I do want to share something of what radio spectrum's done in my life. I should say, first of all, I'm not an engineer. I don't understand it all. I've had a career that has led me to dabble in radio spectrum, but I still see it as magic. I really don't understand it all. At school, I was, my favourite subjects were chemistry and geography, and I went off and I did chemistry and geology at university, and I got my dream job when I started work.
Could I just interrupt again? I'm afraid the microphone isn't working, and some people might have difficulty listening, so I think it might have switched itself off. Do beg your pardon again.
Sorry about this.
Sorry about this.
Is it better?
Right. I know him quite well. He's here to supervise.
Straight out of Faulty Tales, that was.
I think we need to avert our gaze. I think
It's
Don't worry, it's all on video.
Is my battery flat?
it's a great line there.
I think he's finding you up.
This will be going on YouTube, don't worry.
I go like clockwork once it works.
Actually, I can hear it fine, but I've got good hearing, so I suppose.
I've got a spare battery if you want one.
Well, we've got a spare battery in the thing up there, I think.
Good. All we need to do is to bring it here. Pretty good, isn't it? This is the birthplace of wireless.
I know. It's ridiculous. I mean, come on.
It always
You've been
happens.
to how many talks in your life, and how
batteries
many
just
of
off, I'm
these
sure.
the technology?
Always.
No,
It's the first time it's stopped.
Can anyone not hear Jane?
I
Yes.
think we're fine,
Yeah.
but I've got good hearing.
I can hear fine, Jane. No, it's fine.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
I will say at the moment I do currently do a bit of work, a very small amount of work for Tech UK, which is the trade association for consumer electronics. And you'd be amazed at the number of times their technology goes wrong. It's one of those ironies. Anyway, so I got my dream job at the laboratory of the government chemist. I did not mean to have anything whatsoever to do with radio spectrum. But it just sort of caught up with me. And so I'd like to share with you tonight, have you unplugged this one as well?
This is obviously the night, isn't it, where all the little gremlins are going to... there you go.
Try again. There we go. So, I mean, radio spectrum in your life. You know about phones, you know about TV and radio, but Wi-Fi, couldn't live without it now. Car key fobs, smart meters coming your way, loop systems to help the hearing impaired, and wireless mics, yes, well, we all know about them. And then, of course, radio spectrum in public life. It helps events, security services, meteorology, radio astronomy, our emergency services, our train communications, how the cab drivers talk to the rail operating system, air traffic control, and road traffic management. So you might not be able to see these radio waves, but they certainly influence your life. So, small bit of history, and you've probably had this before. We know Mr. Hertz, wonderful German man, discovered electromagnetic waves, and they got called Hertzian waves. You'll hear about Hertz quite a lot as a measure. So, hence Mr. Hertz. And this wonderful quote at the bottom, it says, "I do not think that the wireless waves I have discovered will have any practical application." Famous last words, or not last words. And then there's our hero. I don't need to tell you about Guglielmo Marconi, because here in Chelmsford, that's what we all know about. And I know there are a number of people here in the audience who have worked for the Marconi company or been part of it. And here's my favourite Marconi employee. Some of you may recognise as Jeff Poulter, who worked for the Marconi company from 1946 to 1967, and is better known to me as my dad. And I took no interest in his work whatsoever, except he did build our first television set, which was great. So I did think he was a very clever man. A little bit about basic technology and terminology about spectrum before we get going, just to make sure we all know what we're talking about. I know many of you do. Here we are, wiggly waves, all sorts of different shapes of worms. I don't know that they're necessarily in colour, but the main thing is you can have them in the same space, all travelling at the speed of light, but some of them are long and gentle, and some of them are very hectic and packed together. And it's the number of those that you get in a given period of time, the frequency that we talk about. And we talk about high frequency and low frequency, and it's really the shape of that wiggly worm. The radio spectrum is the part of the great big electromagnetic spectrum towards the bottom that is defined by this frequency range of 3,000 to 300,000 million hertz. And we usually talk about this as 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz, because we can't cope with all those noughts. So here we are. That, if you've got that as the electromagnetic spectrum, all of it, you can see light. You see light. You can see light in the middle. And radio spectrum is this bit down here at lower frequency than light. At this end, we've got exciting things like X-rays and cosmic rays, but we're not going to talk about them because we're interested in this stuff down here. And if you break that out, you get, I love this chart, it's got lots of lovely Fs. F is for frequency, obviously. And radio engineers frequently talk in terms of VHF or UHF or SHF, and it's all this part of the radio spectrum. And if you want to know what all the Fs are, this gives you the idea of what happens from when you go from right the lowest frequencies, where you can do submarine communications, up a bit, and then you get things like time signals. Up a bit more, and you get into the medium wave of radio. Up a bit further, we get shortwave radio. And this is where we start to get in amateurs. Got any amateurs in the room? Yeah, I thought we might have. Love you dearly. BBC World Service. Shortwave, it's part of the characteristics of how it can transmit relatively small amounts of data, information, but over long distances. Then we get to VHF. This is where television started. In the very old days of when television started, it was in this VHF bit, and in some parts of the world it still is, but not in the UK. It's where all the taxi frequencies are, it's where commercial local radio is, and at the moment it's where the emergency services are focused. I'm going to talk a lot this evening about UHF, ultra high frequency, because this is probably the most useful part of the spectrum that we talk about at the moment in terms of commercial services. This is the interesting, really interesting area and where I spent most of my career. But you go up a bit further and you get some really vital services in terms of fixed links that join up networks, and radar, and then I think today we'll probably start to say this bit up here is getting more and more exciting, because as the frequencies get more and more congested, we're finding that we're having to move up here in order to fit in new applications. So some very basic principles about the radio spectrum. The lower the frequency, the thinner that wiggly worm. You can make the radio, well, you can't make the radio waves. The radio waves travel a long way, but they carry very little information. So radio, conventional radio, is low frequency. The higher you come up, the fatter the pipe you can get. You get those compressed together radio waves. So it's like sort of more of your sumo wrestler waves. They can carry a lot more data in them, but they can't travel as far because they're big, fat and clunky. Sorry, that's my idiot's way of trying to explain what's going on here. So in the magic bit of the radio spectrum, we've got this sort of area, particularly between about 1 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz, where you've got a magic bit of the pipe is fat enough to carry a lot of data, and it travels a reasonable distance, but not that far, and it's pretty good at penetrating walls and things like that. So, as we know, if we want our communications and our Wi-Fi and things to work well, we want signals that preferably can be able to get through a wall rather than getting stuck. It's no use having something broadcasting or transmitting out there and it can't get through the wall. Think where it would be with mobile phones if you couldn't get the signal through a building. And this is, in fact, what has been a problem with some of the development of mobile phones. If you're in a building that is old, lots of big fat stone walls, mobile phone signals struggle to get through, and people will be out there in their country cottage saying, reception's rubbish round here. And you say, well, it's down to the physics. The signal can't get through the wall very well. But isn't it a nice, peaceful, quiet holiday? So, UHF band is defined, I don't know who defined it in the first place, but it's defined as 300 to 3000 megahertz, or you can call that 300 megahertz to 3 gigahertz. And it really provides this optimum combination of distance travelled and bandwidth, and hence it's home to broadcasting, mobile phones, and also quite a few other interesting things. So, background over. I want to take a closer look at UHF and some of the things I've been involved in my career as a humble civil servant. I just sort of fell into this. I never meant it to happen, but it did. So here's our UHF. And here are some of the things that are interested in it. So at the lower end, you've got television. Then you've got all these Gs, the various generations of mobile phones. And we can come into why they're scattered through there. There's a bit of Wi-Fi, dedicated Wi-Fi band in there. And then up towards the top here, we've got radar. And all of these things have managing the spectrum around these to fit these services in so they don't interfere with each other. They do work. You can buy equipment, you can buy consumer equipment that makes them work. And how you manage this is the policy challenge, the technical challenge, and it's not getting any easier. I was just getting, I always have to do a crib sheet for this bit. That gap, what's wrong with that, you see? A nice white space, and you sort of think, is there nothing there? And the answer is, it's pretty full. At the moment, it's currently used for aeronautical, satellites for Earth exploration, meteorology and radio navigation, space research, radio astronomy, and there is some particular kinds of mobile and broadcast in there. So it's not empty. Let's start talking a little bit about television, because one of the joys of my career was I got asked to lead the policy work for what was then the Department of Trade and Industry on how to do the switch from analogue to digital television. And this was straight after the 3G mobile phone auction. So it was September 2000, and I'd been doing 3G, and I got asked to go and do a whole raft of communications things, of which a very small part was switchover. It was a gleam in ministers' eyes, really, at that point. Back in '99, Chris Smith, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport at that time, had got up and said that it was the government's aim to switch from analogue to digital television broadcasting when digital television coverage matched analogue coverage, and when switching from analogue to digital was affordable for the vast majority of the population, and that they thought that that could be achieved in the period 2006 to 2010. So I came into this late 2000 and had to come up with a plan for how to do it. And I'm not going to pretend I did it all on my own. We got together a very good working group with the broadcasters, the spectrum planners, the manufacturers of television sets, retailers, consumer groups, and we pulled all this together and said, okay, technically what are we talking about? Economically what are we talking about? And actually what's this going to mean for ordinary viewers at home. And if you wind back to about 2001, when we came up with our first action plan, digital television had been launched. Sky had launched on satellite and had got some interesting content that people were showing that they were beginning to go and spend money, willing to get. So there was also a lot of people going around and saying, I'm never going to have one of those nasty Murdoch dishes on my house. So there was a sort of interesting feel about satellite. We'd got digital terrestrial television. It had launched, and it was called On Digital in those days, and you could get quite a few free-to-view channels, but it was basically a pay platform. And there weren't many free-to-view channels in digital that weren't available in analogue. So if all you wanted was free, it wasn't a very attractive proposition for you. So it was beginning to happen, but it was not a very popular idea at that time. And ministers hate it if there's a thought that you're going to mess with people's telly. So they wanted a gold-plated programme that was going to make sure that nobody was going to be damaged by this. So we had to come up with a way of doing it. And I was involved in two bits, one in particular, one about the spectrum planning and the other about doing the cost-benefit analysis to say, why should we do this? You know, government has said we're going to do it, but why is it a good idea? And it worked out that there were three real reasons why it was a good idea. First of all, there was 25% of homes who were never going to be able to get digital television through an aerial, like they've been getting analogue, unless we switched off analogue. We couldn't find a way to do it. So there was 25% of homes who were going to miss out on free-to-view digital television through an aerial. Secondly, the analogue television's network was at that time almost life expired. Crystal Palace transmitter was coming up to the end of its life expectancy. So you were facing a real issue for the broadcasters of saying, are you going to go and spend money repairing, renewing the old analogue system, or are you going to shut it down and make everything digital? And the third issue was, we worked out that because digital television uses so much less spectrum for the amount of services you can get out there, we could free up about a third of the spectrum and use it for other things, which were likely to be mobile phones. And the value to the economy from that was significantly greater. So we had these three things that all of which added together said, this makes huge economic sense for the country as a whole. But interestingly, of those three, the biggest economic bonus came from extending the coverage of digital television. It wasn't from flogging off the spectrum, though not everybody believes me. So let me just show you a chart which you may or may not be able to see. I'm sorry about the small print on this, but it's been shared with me by a very good friend, Alan Watson, who used to work for NTL Broadcast and then Archiva. And Alan and his colleague Brian Haisler came up with this plan in 2003, so pretty early on in planning times. It says Sandy Heath. Sandy Heath is a transmitter not too far from Bedford. We don't really get services from Sandy Heath here, though you can try and hunt them down. But it's quite a good, interesting illustration, not only because it's a generic plan, but also because Sandy Heath uses broadly the same frequencies as Crystal Palace. And of course here in Chelmsford, at least half of households do get their services from Crystal Palace. The rest get it from Sudbury. So what we've got, this doesn't show up terribly well, I'm sorry about this, but we had got 5 analogue services, BBC 1, BBC 2, ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5. We had also managed to launch 6 digital multiplexes. Now, what's a multiplex? Okay. If you've got analogue BBC 1 coming at you, it takes a TV frequency channel that's 8 megahertz wide. So that 8 megahertz is just BBC 1 analogue coming at you. A digital multiplex can take that 8 megahertz channel and squeeze 4, 5, 6, today about 12 channels down it. So it's massively more efficient. And at this stage, and indeed today, we had got 6 digital multiplexes. So we've got the 5 analogue services that have been there for some time, and we've got these 6 digital multiplexes. But because the 6 digital multiplexes have come on later, they've been squeezed in. So they've got the not so good frequencies, which is one reason why digital terrestrial television was pretty rubbish when it was in its early days. So the plan was, okay, with switchover, what we will do is we will take the analogue frequencies, which are the good ones, they work really nicely, and we'll move the digital multiplexes onto them where we can. So that's one principle we're trying to apply. But the other one was we were saying, we were trying to free up some spectrum, so we didn't want television splatting over all that much if we could splat it over less. And being British, we decided we could chop off some of the top of the spectrum, didn't need to use that for television anymore, and we'd take out a chunk in the middle. So all of this planning was going along around the basis of we want to get the best channels, but we also want to clear some of television altogether. And what this plan was doing was saying, right, we need to switch off one of the analogue channels first. And ITV and Channel 4 and 5 say, well, it can't be one of ours, because you can't switch us off, because that means we'll lose all our advertising revenue, and if you can't be doing that, it has to be the BBC. So the BBC sort of says, well, we can't switch off BBC 1, we'll have to switch off BBC 2. So stage 1, BBC 2, we'll put up some captions that say, it's going soon, if you don't do something, you're not going to be able to watch us. And on the appointed day, night, BBC 2 at Sandy Heath got switched off. And what happened was we moved the digital multiplex called Multiplex 1 up to where BBC 2 used to be. So we were reusing this frequency. That's all right, because what's on Multiplex 1, well, that happened to be a BBC multiplex. So it had got BBC 2 there, but in digital. It also got BBC 1 in digital, and a couple of other things. I think it was Parliament and the news channel. So we thought, right, that's stage 1, and now what we'll do at the same time, we'll put some captions up on BBC 1, ITV, and Channel 4 and 5 saying, and we're going in a month's time. So if you don't get yourself a digital television or a digital box or something, you won't be able to watch us. And then a month later, we did the same thing, switched them off, moved them round. So all the analogue services have gone now. You've got MUX 1, MUX A, MUX 2, all in place, MUX B, MUX C, and MUX D. we managed to compress this. This original plan had it over switching on 3 events over 2 months. We actually compressed that down and we did it on 2 events over a month. And even at the end, we got confident we only did 2 weeks apart. But this sort of thing we had to do all around the country. There are 80 main TV transmitters and over 1,000 relays off them. And we had to work our way around the country, and we did it with all the TV regions. And eventually we did the plan over 2008, 2012, and I'm sure you remember it well. But, so we were able to, there are, squeeze the 6 digital multiplexes in, and now we've got 3 of those digital multiplexes carrying all the public service channels, plus the new channels from BBC and new ones from ITV and Channel 4, and they reach 98.5% of households, which is the same as the analogue services did. Some people say, I can't get all the services, and it depends if you're watching a relay off a main transmitter. The relays only reach, they only carry the 3 public service multiplexes, and they go, we can get to them to all the country. The purely commercial multiplexes, the other 3 multiplexes, they only come off the 80 main transmitters, so they don't go to more than about 90% of the country. So we did all this. Excuse me. And it all went so well. It was supposed to be a media disaster. But we did it on time, under budget, and really nobody noticed. So it was great. It was a great program. I had great fun with that. Phones. Phones. Wow. Some of us can remember life before mobile phones. Across UHF, there are 5 main frequency bands used for phones. And I showed them to you in little blocks before. And they're variously come about. The most recent ones we've added are this bit, which is, oh look, that's what we cleared in TV switchover. It's the top bit of what was TV. And in 2013 it got auctioned off for 4G mobile. And at the same time we did this stuff for 4G mobile. But it's a bit of a jumble. I have to say that the licenses now for mobile phones are technology neutral. So the mobile phone operators can use any of the generations in any of the spectrum they've got. Though they do preferentially use bits for 2G, 3G or 4G. So in the early days, so we go back to the 1980s, the government, remember BT privatisation, some people? Yes, good. And they thought, we'll have this mobile thing, well, the BT will have a licence and we'll give one to somebody else. Anybody want a licence? And Rachel came up with saying, yes, we could do that. And they invented something called voice data phones, Vodafone. And those analogue phones, the yuppie phones, the brick phones, launched in 1985. And I can't claim any connection with that at all. But it was just after that I made my first foray into working in telecoms. And I went back to work after maternity leave, and I'd been doing some telecom stuff before I had the baby. I went back and they said, oh, good, yeah, well, you seem to be getting on with that. Would you like to do all of mobile as well? I had no staff, there was just me. So, why not? Sounds interesting. So I was dealing with Cellnet and Vodafone on their analogue stuff, and then we had this competition in 1989 for what we grandly called personal communications networks. And it was new bit of spectrum up at 1800 megahertz, whereas these first ones were in 900 megahertz. So we awarded 3 licenses in a beauty contest, none of this auction rubbish. And those licenses, before the network started, they compressed down and became 1-to-1, who became T-Mobile and Orange, and they launched in the mid-1990s. And of course, much later, those 2 companies joined and became EE, and then this year, EE has been bought by BT. So then we got really interesting. I did, after that beauty contest, where we just sat and we literally looked at the applications, and you looked through and decided, who is most convincing about how they'll be able to roll out these networks, and will they do it sooner or later, and what sort of services they will do. And we awarded the licenses to the most worthy, and there was no money changing hands or anything. And then a few years later, I got a phone call one day from somebody who said, I understand you were part of the 2G phone competition back in 1989. Well, I'm doing a 3G phone auction. Do you want to be part of that? Yeah, sounds fun. Because this was the UK's first auction of spectrum, and it was for the ever so exciting 3rd generation mobile phones, whatever they might be. And we spent 2.5 years working out how do you auction spectrum. And the idea of an auction was that because spectrum is so valuable, and it was becoming ever more congested, that rather than civil servants like me scrutinising worthy applications and trying to pick winners out of it, the theory was that the people who would use the spectrum most valuably would be the people who were willing to display that value through an auction. Not because we wanted to make lots of money out of this. In fact, the UK law then and the UK law today forbids you to design an auction in order to maximise revenue for the auction. Nobody believes me on that either. But we really did try to design something here which was going to use the spectrum most valuably. Now, when I came into this in 1997, we had our 4 mobile phone operators, the original 2, plus the 2 I'd licensed in '89. And we had this spectrum that was available for 3G. And so we said to the technical folk, okay, how might you divide this up so that it's going to be suitable? He said, oh yes, you can get 3 licenses out of this spectrum. And we said, that's no good, we've got 4 operators already. They'll just fight against each other to the death, and one person will lose out, and that doesn't sound like a very good result, and it certainly doesn't sound like an auction. Can you go away and have another look? Ah, yes, well, the latest technical evidence says we can actually get 4 nice even licenses out of this. Well, that's not much better, is it? Not if you want an auction. I mean, who's going to turn up to bid for a license if you've got 4 existing players and 4 licenses? Because all the existing players will always bid enough money to see anybody else kept out. are you sure you can only get 4 licenses out of this? So magically, our technical people said, well, actually, we can get 5, but they won't be all exactly the same size. So we said, well, that's all right, we can cope with that. If one's a bit bigger than the others, we'll put that one aside for a new entrant, so that we'll guarantee that we have a new entrant, and that will provide more competition, and more competition means you get innovation in services, and that's good for consumers. So we like that. So we came up with this design for 5 licenses that weren't all exactly the same, and then we came up with the design for the auction and how to run that, and we were working with Rothschilds, the merchant bankers, who were going around whipping up enthusiasm for this, and we were saying, yeah, go out, get us lots of people to take part of this auction, and tell them all the wonders of what 3G is. And we said, well, what is it? And because nobody really knew, they hadn't made the handsets yet. It was coming along quite nicely, but it was novel. So we had this wonderful thing from the lead Rothschilds guy, and he said, well, you'll be able to send postcards from the beach in Bali on your phone. So this became the sort of catchword, and whether we believed it or not, that was the idea. You would be able to somehow send, because 3G allowed you to send more data, you would be able to send things like pictures rather than just phone calls. And anyway, we sort of waited with bated breath on the day that the applications were due to come in. And in order to apply, they had to do 2 things. They had to turn up with a physical paper application to our offices in Docklands, and they had to lodge at the bank a £50 million deposit, or £100 million if they thought they were going to buy a licence for more than 400 million. And by 11 o'clock that morning, we had got 5 written applications and 4 lots of money, and they weren't particularly from the same people. So we suddenly thought, oh my goodness, this is going to work. And we had 13 bidders. And it took us, because we were very cautious, it's the first auction, we really didn't want this to go wrong. We took it very slowly, and for 4 weeks, the money just went up and up and up. And we thought, this is getting silly. There was a point where Rory Kettle-Jones from the BBC came along. The BBC had not they thought this was boring. The other news people were quite interested. BBC didn't want to know. Now Rory Kettle-Jones came along one day and we said, yes, you can come in and see the bidding happening. And believe it or not, we were using old-fashioned fax machines, because this was in 2000, and we were worried about things like the Millennium Bug and security. So we were using secure fax machines. We said, you can come and see the auction, you can see a bidding round. You'll have to be locked in for the round, but you can come and do that, and you can come and see, because we're expecting in this particular round that somebody, quite possibly Vodafone, will bid £2 billion for a licence. And sure enough, there was Rory Kettle-Jones standing over this fax paper coming through. I mean, we edited it out for him doing a transmission for the BBC, but it was £2 billion. I saw it. And of course, that wasn't the end of the story. We went on further, and by the time we got to the end of round 150 on the 27th of April, the year 2000, these were the final prices. I mean, it's quite staggering, that sort of £22.47 billion. And everybody sort of says that was evil of you to take that money out of the telecoms industry. And we say, we didn't ask them to do it, they just wouldn't stop bidding. We couldn't, They were there with their advisors. How did we stop them? They willingly paid it. They may regret it later, but we couldn't actually stop it. Gordon Brown said thank you very much. And this, genuinely, we are told, went to pay off a great chunk of the national debt. And we were told at the time that was the equivalent to what would have been a penny rise on income tax. So, think what you will, but that was the 3G auction. The 4G auction in 2013 was much more modest. It only made 2.4 billion. It was a much more complicated auction. It was run by Ofcom. They were trying to, it was a combined auction because they were doing this 800 megahertz chunk, which had been television. And they were doing stuff much higher at 2.6 gigahertz, which had been vacant for years. We'd been trying to get rid of it some way since about 2006. But we did it as a combined auction. And you can see the prices were much more modest, though somehow Vodafone once again ended up paying loads more than anybody else. So auctions are fun. In order to run that last auction, we had to make sure the spectrum was clean and clear. One of the things about auctions, and why there will only ever be a limited number of them, you need to be able to sell spectrum that there are likely to be more demand for than you've got licenses for, and that you can clearly define what it is you're selling. And that means we want things to be fairly clean. Now in this case, one of the issues was that the spectrum at 2.6 gigahertz, which itself had been empty for some time, was adjacent to this radar band. And God bless the civil and military radars, but they had been put in a time of relative plenty, when it didn't matter too much how clean and tidy their radar equipment was. So if they splatted over the edge of it, it didn't matter too much. But we were going to sell the 2.6 gigahertz spectrum for mobile phone services. And the mobile phone operators were going to be really unhappy if radar was splatting into their spectrum. So we went round and modified the radars at every single airport in the country, both Ministry of Defence and civil. We had an interesting little wrinkle with the US Air Force at Heath, because of course the US Air Force at Heath is US territory. We can't tell them what to do. We can tell them they're right in the middle of our radio waves, and their radio waves don't recognise the boundaries, and therefore they might just have a problem with their aircraft if they didn't do something about their radar, but we couldn't make them change. They finally got the message, but that was an interesting diplomatic incident. The other thing about this is we're not at all sure that modern radar really needs to use that much spectrum. And so we've been working very closely with both civil and military radar to say, couldn't you perhaps modernise and use less spectrum? One of the principles we have at the moment is that in order to manage all the radio spectrum well, everybody should pay for it, pay the appropriate value that says it's being used by the right people who use that bit of spectrum most valuably in terms of the UK interest. So, Ministry of Defence, Department for Transport have to pay to use their spectrum. And we're quite clearly saying to them, well, if you use less, you'd have to pay less. So there is a bit of an incentive there. But it's going slowly. And this last point here, in the end of 2010, we published a plan that said the public sector manages about 22% of UK spectrum. That's probably much more than the public sector needs to use in future. So we will aim to release 500 megahertz of spectrum below 5 gigahertz by 2020 and release it from public sector use so that it can be used for whatever, market interests. And that plan's sort of coming along, and 100 megahertz of this radar spectrum was included in it. It's been a struggle, and one of the things is we haven't got international agreement on alternative uses. This is internationally harmonised for radar, so putting another commercial, say mobile phones in there, isn't particularly attractive globally. So at the moment, we've just done my former colleagues have just published an update on the 2010 statement. This came out in April last month. And the revised government target overall is to come out with 750 megahertz of public sector spectrum below 10 gigahertz by 2022, including the original 500 by 2020. And this radar spectrum is now expected to be not released to the market, but shared with other public sector users. So it will be freed from radar, but not as we first thought. The other thing that was important in that spectrum that we flogged off in 2013 relates to the emergency services. Something I learnt a lot when I was trying to do this. Breathing apparatus telemetry. So firemen, when they go into fires where they can't really see what they're doing, and they're sort of groping around in the smoke and all the rest of it, they have little bleepy radio-connected things connected to their breathing apparatus that keeps track on them and obviously sends messages back to outside so that they can be pulled out if necessary or guided. And this breathing apparatus telemetry equipment was using frequencies right at the top of the TV spectrum, right next to the top of TV. Well, that was where we were clearing it from TV and handing it over to the mobile phone people. And that was not a good place for having a safety of life service. So the breathing apparatus folk moved down to 469 megahertz, which is just underneath where television is. And they hope they'll be safe there for a while. There's also a dedicated network using Tetra technology, which has for the last 15, 20 years or so been enabling all our blue light services to operate. It's operated by a company called Airwave. Those contracts with the different area police, fire and rescue services around the country expire between 2016, this year, and 2020. And we've been looking at what future emergency services networks should look like. Should you carry on using Tetra, which is great for voice, and it's great for two-way voice control. But most emergency services folk these days really want to be able to use the sort of kit that they use as ordinary individuals. They want to be able to have pictures. They want to have geomapping. They want to be able to, if they want to be able to connect, an ambulance wants to be able to connect with the doctors and have pictures and information, all the rest of it. They really want to be having something like a smartphone. And So there has been a deal done with, after a competition, with EE, and the vast majority of the emergency services networks will now use one of these new 800 megahertz 4G networks. There are arrangements in place about extending coverage beyond what is commercially happening, and it's great for video and voice. There are one or two loose ends left that mean there may have to be a few additions, but it's coming along quite nicely, which is just as well given that the first airwave contract expires this year. So, what next? Well, first of all, what next for TV and mobile? It's not all finished for television. You know, we did a good tidying up with the TV switchover and released quite a lot of spectrum. But before we'd even finished that, we were talking about taking another slice off the top of the TV spectrum, the so-called 700 megahertz band. And this has been agreed internationally. The 700 megahertz band has been used across the Americas and across Asia Pacific for mobile services for some time. Europe, Africa and the Middle East have been lagging on this one, simply because, well, not simply because, we have been more intensive users of television in the band, and therefore clearing out for mobile in this band has been a much bigger challenge to even consider in Europe, particularly when we've only just about got through digital switchover. But there is a European agreement that we should get out of 700. And, you know, topical stuff, the EU decision, I should have updated this slide. I wrote it 2 days ago. The EU decision that has been agreed by the Council of Ministers yesterday says that the 700 megahertz band must be available to mobile broadband by the 30th of June 2020 in all 28 member states of the European Union. There's a sort of wobble clause for up to 2 years if you can come up with a good reason. And there's a plan here. You've got to be able to do your, I mean, radio waves. They don't recognise any of our political boundaries. They just go where they like. So if you're trying to do national plans, you have to do a lot of international coordination of how things work. So what are the preferred frequencies for broadcasting TV in England are different from the ones in France, so that they don't mess with each other across the channel. And that interlocking network happens all across all the countries of the world, but you can imagine it's pretty intense in the land block of Europe because we have so many countries with so many borders. And it gets even fuzzier round the edge when you're trying to deal with non-European countries. At least within Europe, all our TV channels are 8 megahertz wide. The Russians, I think, use 7 megahertz. So trying to mesh in with them, hairy. So this is the framework of a decision. The European politics, when you hear, this has been agreed by the Council of Ministers. The Parliament, the European Parliament, has not yet taken a position, and this will only become law when the Parliament and the Council agree. But meanwhile, we're assuming it's going to happen because the timescales that are here mean we need to get on with it. It's not too much of a problem for the UK because we were sort of working for this timetable anyway, which is often what happens. We are quite influential in Europe in knocking common sense into ideas that don't look as if they'll fly too well. And we don't often find ourselves in a position, in terms of spectrum at least, where the EU is coming out with something that isn't what we wanted anyway. So we will be moving TV out of the 700 megahertz band. Do you need to be worried? Probably not. For, I should think, pretty well everybody in the room, most of this will be just about doing another one of those wretched retunes on the television. And either your TV will do it for you, or by now you know how to do one. It's not good news for the citizens of Manchester, because up there they have all their TV basically using 694 to 790 megahertz. And if they've got an old style aerial which was designed just to work on those frequencies, I'm afraid they're going to have to go and get a new aerial, because they will be shifted down to lower frequencies. The government has put aside £500 million for helping this happen, helping the broadcasters at least make it happen, because this isn't really in the interest of the broadcasters, and they're saying, of course we can do it, but who pays? There'll be something in the BBC Charter about it. And even then, that's not necessarily the end of it. Because at the international level, we have everything. We have a great jamboree about every 4 years called the World Radio Communications Conference, which is an arm of the ITU, which is an arm of the United Nations. So it's big treaty stuff. And roughly every 4 years, all the countries of the world get together to sort out frequency allocations for spectrum and make changes. And one of the things they did at last autumn's WRC is say, in 2023, when we expect to meet, we want to review everything in that core UHF band from 470, the bottom of where television is now, up to 960, which is the top of the, what I call the old mobile band. So they're really looking and saying, are we using this well for broadcasting and for mobile, and for other things that are in that spectrum? Things like PMSE. Have I got one? Can't remember. Oh yes, programme making and special events. It's always been the tag-along friend, if you like, with TV. TV's been the primary user in its frequencies, but nestling in along there are things that help make TV work well and other services. So it provides the frequencies, for example, for doing news gathering and doing outside broadcasts. It provides for wireless microphones. So whether you're in a village hall or a hall like this or a church, you know, that's programme making and special events frequencies as well. And you've got the two types. You've got the audio, which does in-ear microphones and performers, you know, all those lovely singers up on the stage. They've always got mics on, and that's using frequencies like this. And then you've got video that's very much about news gathering and getting out there at sporting events and things like that. Well, it's all right being the secondary user, pottering along at low levels in local areas with TV, when TV's got quite a lot of spectrum. But you can see that as TV gets tidier and tidier in its spectrum, there are fewer and fewer gaps in between to provide spectrum for PMSE. And that is getting to be quite critical now. And in March this year, Ofcom in the UK came out and said, right, we've got an answer. that we think will work in the UK and should work elsewhere as well. We think that audio PMSE, so things like wireless mics, can reasonably share with aeronautical radio navigation. You know, we've done tests, we don't see why those things can't actually share the spectrum. And hence, we're saying in the UK, audio PMSE should be able to move to 960 to 1165. The audio PMSE guys are not entirely convinced. They're a very conservative bunch. But the other thing is that at the moment nobody's making equipment for this band. So it's got to be convincing. If we're right and it works, it's a good solution and there'll be a huge market for this and the UK could start being a market leader. So it could be really innovative and good. But we're not quite there yet. So that's PMSE. 5G mobile. Well, I'm going to come back to that because the 5G is, what is it, where is it? Colleagues of mine have tried to explain it as it's the feeling that you've got your internet connectivity as much as you want wherever you are. So you can have everything you want wherever you are. But the standards aren't defined yet. The Koreans are going to start services in 2018. It could use some of this lower spectrum. It almost certainly going to use stuff much higher up the spectrum than I've been talking about tonight, because as we know, up there you can get fatter pipes. And that is probably what 5G needs. But that's a whole story on its own, 5G. But then there's a whole load of other stuff that's fascinating about spectrum that I'll just tantalise you with rather than talk about. More Wi-Fi. Who can live without Wi-Fi? Again, being topical, and for those of you who like your homework, go onto the Ofcom website and have a look at this consultation published last week. So their estimate is that 22 of the 27 million households in the UK use Wi-Fi today. And then of course you've got all the Wi-Fi at coffee shops and stations and out and about. And the conditions on which Wi-Fi operate are different, whether it's indoor or outdoors. So 2.4 gigahertz, you remember on that chart of UHF I did with all the coloured blocks, I said, oh look, there's a Wi-Fi band. Well, that was the 2.4 gigahertz band. It's been there for a long while, but it's pretty chocker. It's not only got Wi-Fi in there, it's got all sorts of license-exempt applications, and it is chocker. So there is a second band, 5 gigahertz, which has been allocated to Wi-Fi and license-exempt services for quite a long while, but it's been much less popular. We reckon now that if you get a new router for your broadband at home, it'll almost certainly come 5 gig capable, as well as 2.4. So it'll look around as to what it's got in your home environment. But the problem is that there really isn't enough spectrum for Wi-Fi at the moment, given how much we've become dependent on it. And finding it, because Wi-Fi uses something called license-exempt spectrum. So instead of turning up to Vodafone or whatever and saying, here's your license, here's your dedicated spectrum, here are the terms and conditions on what you can use it, you say, look everybody, here's some frequencies you can play with. As long as you go and buy kit that works there, it's a free-for-all. You're not protected from anybody and nobody's protected from you. So spectrum managers, policy wonks like me, are very nervous about making too much of a spectrum open to license exempt, because once you do that, it's sort of impossible ever to reclaim it for anything else. So you have to think quite hard before you allow that free-for-all. But it's a topical issue, and it affects all sorts of other people in this area of 5 gigahertz, where we hope to expand, because we've got all these fun things down here at the bottom, you know, weather, earth exploration, intelligent transport, and of course, smarters. The Internet of Things, machine to machine. Anybody who was here when Danielle George came, you remember she was talking about some of the interesting applications of Internet of Things and how they are tackling some of the big issues of the world around poverty and land management and, you know, making agriculture work better. You can certainly see, I would certainly predict that we will see a transformation in public services and particularly in health services as we have ubiquitous broadband. It's everywhere in our homes, and this ability to change us going to the doctor, us going to the hospital, to those services coming to us. The ability to track and monitor your health and to report that can absolutely transform our public services and the costs around that. Mentioned farming a bit. Drones, unmanned UAVs in the terminology, unmanned aerial vehicles, but they rely on having spectrum, frequency allocation. People get worried about the military ones and the spying on it, but I mean, when you hear that Amazon are delivering by drone, perhaps we think they're not so bad after all. And this last one, you know, flight tracking. I first put it up there to reference MH370, the Malaysian Airways flight that went down, because when that was lost, there was quite an immediate reaction in the spectrum world that said, if we adopted a different technology and assigned some more frequencies for the tracking systems on aeroplanes, we can't be sure, but we have greater confidence that we would have been able to track MH370 and other planes over great expanses of ocean. Most of our tracking systems at the moment work fine over land, but they're not good over big oceans. And indeed, at the World Radio Conference last year, that was, I think, the first international decision taken to open up the frequencies so we could expand flight tracking. And anybody who was listening to or following the news reporting about the loss of the Egypt Air flight last week will know that they were talking about the signals that were received back from the plane and the importance of how do those signals get back? They use spectrum. So it gets everywhere. So, radio spectrum, it's finite. We can't make more of it, but we can use technology to help us get more out of it. It's valuable. I'm waiting for an update on this, but the analysis that we published in 2012 said that in 2011 it was worth about £52 billion to the UK economy. And in March 2014, I wrote words that the Prime Minister delivered saying that it is our aim to double that contribution to the economy by 2025. And I think that's fairly easily done. But, and I just think it's exciting because it makes our lives worth living. Thank you very much.
So Jane, I think, will you take some questions?
Well, I'll try.
Right. Do we have any questions for Jane? Yes,
I have one. There seems to be loads of stuff on 2.4 gigs. I fly model aircraft, they're on 2.4 gigs.
Yes.
And a lot of bell pushes and car things and so on are on 2.4 gigs. That must be really stacked full of stuff.
It is. It's absolutely congested, and that's why you get these odd incidents of my garage door won't open when it should, because there's been interference and you get congested. Because it's a free-for-all band, there is no protection. You can go out and use it if the equipment works, but you have no protection. So that's why we're trying to find some other bands that will provide more space. So yes. Yes, sorry.
As it seems the exciting stuff, as you say, in radio language, with the broad pipes and everything, what's going to happen to all the stuff with the narrow?
Well, it's quite interesting down at the narrow end, because yes, it's more limited because you can't carry much data, but we think there are quite a few new applications coming along for some of the Internet of Things. So where you've got something where you just want to send little bits of information, not too often, smart meters, for example, they don't need to talk very often, and they may well be able to be quite patient about when they talk. So we think that may well be the option for using frequencies there. But interestingly, it's one of the great debates we've had about should there be a digital radio switchover, like there was a digital television switchover. But because radio uses those low frequencies, there is being just that question of saying, well, if you don't use it for radio, what are you going to use it for? So what's the point of not using it for radio? But we do think now that Internet of Things might be the answer. Hello.
Yep.
Yeah.
Do we have a handle on the overall power efficiency of digital radio when compared to analog? Most portable digital radio, or mains digital radios take a lot more power to resolve digital signals than the analog, two transistor little thing in the bathroom, although the digital transmitters take less power themselves. So what's the balance?
I haven't seen the latest figures. We did quite a lot of analysis on this 5 or 6 years ago, and certainly the more modern digital radios were a lot more efficient in terms of energy consumption than the first ones. Whether they had got to the point where they were as efficient as typical analogue radios that you would buy today, rather than to try and compare like with like, I'm not sure. But as you say, that on the transmission side, they're more efficient, or at least as efficient. On the consumer side, it's been difficult, but they're a lot better than they were. But I haven't seen the latest test figures.
Yeah, concerns. One of the concerns regarding spectrum and their effect on us, really, human beings with Wi-Fi. I've got a booster as well in my house, and what's it? Is it only radar and X-rays that are dangerous to some people? I mean, do these Wi-Fis go through us?
Yes, they do. I mean, spectrum's going through you all the time, and has been since you were born. One of the things we had to deal with at the time of the 3G phone auction was the height of the mobiles fry your brains. Mobiles are either, base stations are bad for you, or mobile episodes. And it's always hard to prove a negative, but there are no known health issues relating to any of the radio frequencies that I've been talking about.
except in respect of the content that gets
Not as a form of electromagnetic.
Right, Simon.
I'm not a scientist, so I don't understand why there's a limit at the bottom and the top. It seems to me to be an arbitrary limit. What is beyond 300 gigahertz and below?
You're right. It just, we're talking energy here, so there are no finite limits. Is that right, Peter? Have I got that one right? There are no absolute limits. It's just what we're talking here about the spectrum that people can conceivably measure and have any sense of being able to use.
I thought your analogy of the pipes was very good. You know, at the low end, it's a very narrow pipe, and the further you go up in the spectrum, it's wider, and it just keeps getting bigger.
Yeah.
So you can put more stuff through it.
Yeah.
But there's no limit.
No.
Well, there is, because you can get limited on range, you can get limited on all sorts
Well,
of things.
apart from that.
Yes.
I presume, though, that what you're talking about is probably that defined by the ITU and that which you discuss, isn't it? And that which you allocate.
Yes.
Because clearly you can be going either side of that. And indeed, if we go to optical wavelengths, one of the problems you talked about is 2.4 gigs and how you do Wi-Fi in the home. You start to look at optical techniques for transmitting data.
Yes.
Which is one way of freeing up some of that radio frequency spectrum. But I think probably you were...
Won't go through walls.
No, but it's just a way of dealing with some of the requirements.
Yes.
So I think probably what you're talking about is that which is within the ITU.
Yes.
And the kind of thing you've been involved in, which is determining what you're going to use the bits of spectrum for.
But you are right. In nature, in life, there are things below 3 kilohertz. There are things above 300 gigahertz. It's just we draw the line somewhere when we're talking about radio spectrum.
So Simon's part two.
Because obviously it's fascinating, and I'm not an engineer, so I have no idea what I'm talking about. But why can't using the pipe analogy, why can't you squeeze everything through one pipe, and then at the other end, it decides what it's going to be used for. So 4G combined with digital TV, for instance, and then your phone or your TV works out what to receive.
Interestingly, there's quite a lot of work going on at the moment to see how you could indeed mix mobile and phone technologies. There are variants of the specifications for mobile phones which allow for what you and I might call television, because it's audio-visual content in there. And there are people who are working on projects to try and see how you can do that. When you're trying to deal with services that you definitely don't want to mix, it's the issue of interference, and you're trying to keep them separate rather than this fantastic data soup that somehow has a way of sorting itself out. But you are quite right that these labels that we've traditionally put onto services may well break down in future, and it is just a load of data, and it goes in a data soup. It's rather like the analog and digital television thing. If you go along to a TV transmitter, and the great big mast, it's got things, antennas at the top blasting out, but down at the bottom there'll be some boring cabinets, metal cabinets, with some cables coming in and cables going out to feed the stuff up the mast to the transmitter at the top. And it's just a digital soup in there. So a digital TV multiplex, it's got BBC One, BBC Two, BBC Three, BBC Four, all jumbled together. I don't know how they know who they are. It comes in one end, squirts round, goes up there, comes out, hits my area, comes down and becomes programs. And I think you are right that approach will expand in some areas.
Yes.
Do you have any any idea of what's going on say, time division technology?
I'm not up to date. I mean, they are trying. It is one of those things where, with the 3G auction, some of the inequalities in the spectrum licenses, because there's TDD frequencies included in some licenses and not, and it really didn't get used very much. And there are some proposals at the moment, I think, for trying to do more TDD, but it's not been as popular as people thought it might be a decade ago. But you'd have to ask somebody closer into.
And it seems to me, that with splitting the time, you could get, in a serial manner, umpteen channels down the same hole. So to speak.
Yes.
But that's what TV's already doing.
Surely that's happening already.
Multiplex.
Yeah.
That's
what
TV does.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, but in mobile phones it's different.
But in Wi-Fi it's time.
Yes.
It's moved on a bit since your name.
I know, getting old.
Marconi was a genius, wasn't he? And he took what was a relatively unknown scientific development and experimented and pushed the boundaries of what was thought to be possible. And people found it really difficult to struggle with the concept of how you could send messages out of sight through the ether. And he worked at that and showed how it could be done. And that has absolutely transformed our lives, because the ability for us each to share conversations, one-to-one or multi-way, has just enabled not just personal connections, keeping families together around the world, and making business happen around the world, making our 24-hour, 7-day-a-week happen. It's the opportunities there for having one global community that works and thrives together. And I would argue that it's this chap who initiated all that. I mean, there have been great people since who've built on it, but that magic of how you use radio spectrum to communicate, when you can't see it, you can't feel it, and yet it has this power for communication. I think he's tremendous, and I think I cannot understand why Chelmsford does not cherish him more, and I cannot understand why, if I had gone into schools around here and tried to challenge particularly young girls to become engineers, and I say, you really want to be radio engineers, just think of the excitement there in the development. And they don't seem to catch the vibe. And I think we really ought to make Marconi up front, central to Chelmsford life, and be proud of it.
Yeah.
When it's not lost, we still have signposts that this is the birthplace.
Indeed we do.
Thank goodness for those signposts.
Well, I think, Jane, that's a fitting tribute to the kind of things that we've been doing here for the last 3 months, which is to raise the awareness of what Marconi had done in Chelmsford and the importance of this particular building in the very early part of the birth of the wireless age. I think there's a lot of people in Chelmsford that had never heard of Hall Street before. Obviously, there's a lot of people that knew about Marconi, because a lot of families are connected with the Marconi company. Most people know about New Street. Many of our visitors started off their quest to come and see us by actually accidentally visiting New Street, but they are now aware of Hall Street. Sadly, we are going to be closing on Sunday evening or Sunday afternoon. We had a limited opportunity, a 3-month opportunity to have this exhibition and all these talks here. We are still talking with the developer about what are the possibilities that come the completion of the refurbishment that we could get back in here, but we do have to raise an awful lot of money to do that, 380k that I think Steve mentioned earlier on. We are looking at a possibility of a Heritage Lottery Fund application. That's quite a complex process and time consuming. So all things are possible, but whatever we do, we are hoping that our efforts here will have raised the profile of Marconi's work, and indeed all the citizens of Chelmsford who have been employed by Marconi and have contributed to his success over the decades, that will end up with something more than we've got currently in Chelmsford at the moment, be it here or somewhere else, and I truly believe that we've succeeded in making a change to that, but we'll see what that's going to be. But anyway, thank you very much.
Good.
Cheers.